Hey everybody, this is Brad Dyke reaching out to you and talking a little bit about how can you take a configuration of multiple NICs, 1 gigers or more, and give me more bandwidth. Give me more, I want more, basically, in a nutshell. So, with that being said, one of the key details here is, can it be done? Well, the answer is, yeah, it can actually. We've been doing it for a long time. And two, what do I need to, give myself some extra bandwidth? And what's the easiest way? So, with that, we're going to talk about how to use multiple NICs or configurable NICs that have multiple ports and scale to what we call full duplexing, which is basically two ports acting as one, or many ports acting as one in an adaptive load balancing format. So, what am I talking about? Well, in a nutshell, what I'm talking about is I can take a 4-port server class network switch like this, which is an HP card, or I can take two 10 gigabit ports here like this, and these are both TCP based network cards, and I can make this into about 3.5 gigabit in an ALB configuration or in a paired configuration where I can actually get a lot of bandwidth, and I can make this guy into a full duplex 10 gigabit. Now, there are some restrictions on this. One, you need the software that comes with the network card. You have to get that because that will offer you the option to be able to do teaming. And teaming means you can take the two ports and make them into one VPort, a virtual network interface, a VNI. Now, VPCs exist in the AWS worlds, but this is not that. This is where you're creating a third NIC out of the first two NICs. And all communication is routed between those port interfaces into the virtual NIC, giving you more combined bandwidth. Now, you can run dual port, which means you can read at the same time and you can write at the same time, if the software is supportive, it should. And that gives you basically what we call full duplexing. In other words, I can read and write at the exact same time. Very nice feature, much faster than a single connection, because either you're doing read transmissions or you're doing write transmissions, and that's something that's value. Now the NTU, that's this big guy here, it's the networking processing unit, is important too. So when you're working in the software, make sure that you're taking advantage of the software setting options for the NTU to offload the network processing interface. Now this guy here, he's a QLogic set HP 4 port server administration card, and it's a pretty nice card actually. And this one's a little different than when you can actually do teaming for full duplexing porting right here. Now, when you do duplexing here, a lot of times people will do this, so they'll run them at two separate switches which have two different infrastructures, and we call that high availability and redundancy failover. Very common maneuver. That's why you always see two ports on a server card as opposed to one port on a PC card. Over here is the same situation. A lot of times people run two ports to one switch and two ports to another switch, or a combination of them, and they'll duplex these two ports into two separate teams, which will create two separate virtual network connections, and those are the actual ones handling all the TCP traffic. And the load balancing is happening in the background with these very, very, very nice NTUs back here in the back. Now, these MPUs right here and the NTU in the center help litigate that overhaul, but about the maximum you can get on a 4-port 1 gigabit card like this is roughly about 3.2, 3.5 gigabit. That's pretty doggone awesome. But there's one other little problem. If you go over here to your network switch and all you have is 8 ports, ouch, because you really can't get any more bandwidth beyond the switch. Not unless you have a lot of expensive switch gear set up to do that kind of bandwidth from switch to switch to switch. So what ends up happening is people will have the servers, they want the high bandwidth communication to happen on the single switch. 4 ports here, 4 ports here, 4 ports here. And they're getting 3.5 gigabit bandwidths for the requirements. And that is a poor man's way of getting high bandwidth. Now this is a 10 gigabit switch, and I've got a lot of bandwidth here, so I can technically take the workload of the higher bandwidth, but this switch cannot. The best I can do is full duplex 1 gigabit between these two guys right here, and that's just not going to work. So just to give you that realization check, rock and roll here for doing all types of cool things when it comes to working with server-to-server kind of transactions, backups, and so on. So when you're working with these cards, and they are pretty awesome, you have to remember one very important detail. They do give you some really serious advantages in being able to go beyond 1 gig but be under 10 gig. They also have their limitations. You'll learn that. Now, of course, being on one switch means that, you know, you're going to have to do probably some remote terminaling, or if your server's in the same room with your PC, then you're okay. You can do it that way. There are many different possibilities you can do. And, you know, the other question is, why would I do this? What value would I have in doing this? Well, Plex store archiving is a very good strategy. For instance, you could have basically a let's say a network card in the back end that's running on a isolated switch that's running at 3.5 gigabit, and it can be on the Plex store offloading backups of your equipment. That's really cool. Of course, backups in general on a secondary NIC that's got high bandwidth is also really beneficial as well, because it does give you more bandwidth. Now, one kind of thing you've got to be careful with when you start thinking, how can I use these things? You know, obviously backup is really good. High bandwidth throttling is really good. Stress loading is really great. But if you've got a no-name switch, then most likely there's a really good chance that you have an underutilized bus. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, here I've got a Netgear switch right there, as you can see down there below. And here I have a Nortel, right? Well, that Nortel switch has 1.2 gigabit bandwidth per port, including the fiber optic GBICs, which means even this is a 52 port switch, it's got roughly 60 gigabit to 65 gigabits of bus bandwidth on the back end of the switch. Down here, this one is a little lower. It's a little bit more than 1 gig per port, and that's a 24 port switch with 2 GBICs, so roughly about 30. So 30 gigabit bus speed there. So that's a limiter on working with these network switches. If you had, for instance, a lot of these on board and you're saturating a switch and you just can't see why, hey, now that I've had all the gear, I'm starting to see slowdown. The reason why is because that no-name switch may have a very poor back-end bus to handle those RJ45 connections or their fiber optic connection. This happens a lot. You know, we can't afford the expensive Cisco gear and HP and Dell gear, so we go for the next unknown, and they don't always have the best results. So, with that being said, it's important to understand what is the limitations of your switch. If you have a no-name switch, like my 10 gig switches are really nice, but they don't have any much more overhead than basically 10 gig per port. So that gives me about a 92 gigabit bandwidth on an 8-port switch. That's kind of tight, but it's okay. It was cheap. It does it. I'm not overstressing my switch, so I'm happy with it. Just remember, as you're trying to tweak out that bandwidth to get the maximum result, it takes a lot of NTU play. It takes a lot of software configuration on your NICs to kind of tweak them out, just to kind of get it to where you can get it. And if you discover that you put one too many servers in the equation, back off and have some fun with what you got. After all, that's what we're doing here, right? We're just experimenting to have some really cool times, learning how to do really cool things. Well, this is Brad Dyke signing off. I hope you guys have a great week. Like if you like, and goodbye.